The Echo of a Missing Half. Chapter 1, The Familiar Stranger. The fluorescent hum of the hospital was a constant, low drone, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of a kindergarten classroom where Sarah spent her days. She wasn't here as a teacher, but as a worried wife. Her husband David was recovering from an unexpected appendectomy, and Sarah, always needing to be productive, had offered to volunteer at the hospital in the afternoons. It was a way to fill the anxious hours, to feel useful amidst the quiet beeps and hushed footsteps of the medical world. Sarah, a woman in her late 40s, had always felt a subtle, indefinable ache, a sense of something missing, a quiet echo in the chambers of her soul. She was loved, she had a good life, a fulfilling career, but there was a void, a persistent whisper of incompleteness she couldn't quite articulate. She often dismissed it as a fanciful notion, a leftover from childhood loneliness, as she was an only child. One Tuesday afternoon, the charge nurse approached her. "Sarah, dear, could you help us in room 312? We have a new patient, Michael Thompson. He's in a critical state, unconscious, needs a transfusion. His blood type is incredibly rare, and we're struggling to find a compatible match quickly. We're testing all available staff and volunteers with the rare blood type." Sarah, who knew her blood type was a less common O negative, readily agreed. A small prick, a quick draw. The blood would be rushed to the lab. She returned to folding laundry, the mundane rhythm a comfort. An hour later, Dr. Stevens, a stern but kind physician, found her. His face was a mixture of surprise and profound curiosity. "Ms. Miller," he began, "your blood sample. It's not just a match for Mr. Thompson. It's an almost perfect match, beyond what we typically see in mere compatible donors. We're talking about an identical match across a vast array of genetic markers, not just blood type." Sarah frowned. "What does that mean, doctor?" Dr. Stevens's gaze was unblinking. "It means, Ms. Miller, that you are biologically related to Mr. Thompson. Very closely related, like a sibling. A very, very close sibling." A cold tremor ran down Sarah's spine. A sibling? She was an only child. Always had been. Her parents, Elizabeth and John, had always been clear on that. No siblings, no long-lost relatives, just the three of them. "That's impossible," Sarah stated, her voice flat with disbelief. "I'm an only child." Dr. Stevens gestured towards room 312. "Perhaps you should see him, Miss Miller. The resemblance, it's quite striking, disturbingly so." Reluctantly, Sarah walked down the hallway, her heart thumping against her ribs. Room 312. She pushed open the door. A man lay in the bed, pale and still, hooked up to a tangle of tubes and wires. His face was gaunt, etched with pain, but even in his unconscious state, the features were undeniably, eerily familiar. The same high cheekbones, the same strong jawline, the same subtle curve of the lips. His hair, though grayer and thinner, was the same shade of sandy brown as her own. It was like looking at a distorted, older version of herself, a male version. A gasp escaped her lips. He was the echo of that missing half, the embodiment of the void she had always felt. He was a familiar stranger, a reflection she had never seen. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "A twin." The word hung in the sterile air, heavy with the weight of decades of unspoken truth. Her twin, the sister she never had, the brother she never knew. Her entire life, built on the foundation of being an only child, shattered in an instant. The faint hum of the hospital now sounded like a silent scream. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Nursery. The days that followed were a blur of shock and disbelief. Sarah stayed by Michael's bedside, her hand often resting on his, feeling an inexplicable pull, a deep, ancient connection that defied logic. When he stirred, when his eyes fluttered open, they were the same hazel as her own, filled with a hazy confusion that mirrored her own turmoil. He was a piece of her, a part of her soul that had been missing for half a century. Dr. Stevens confirmed their suspicions with more genetic tests. Identical twins. The results were conclusive. The medical world had provided irrefutable proof of a bond that had been severed at birth. The emotional storm raging within Sarah was overwhelming. Love, confusion, anger, a profound sense of loss for the years stolen from them both. She confronted her parents, Elizabeth and John, the moment they arrived at the hospital, their faces etched with concern for David. She held up the DNA report, her voice trembling. "Mom, Dad, who is Michael Thompson? And why does this test say he's my identical twin?" Elizabeth's face drained of color. John's jaw tightened, his gaze darting away. A heavy, suffocating silence descended, far more damning than any confession. Finally, John, his voice raspy, spoke. "Sarah, sweetheart, sit down. We have something to tell you." The story unfolded, painful word by painful word, a confession 50 years in the making. It was 1970. They were young, barely out of their teens, living in a small, struggling farming community in rural Ohio. Money was scarce. Hope was thinner. Elizabeth had gone into labor unexpectedly, weeks early. Twin boys. Michael, born minutes after Sarah, was tiny, frail. The doctor, a stern, older man, had taken John aside. "Mr. Miller," the doctor had said, his voice grave, "your wife has had a difficult delivery, and the second twin, he's very weak. His chances are slim. We have a family, a well-to-do family, desperate for a child. They've been trying for years. They're willing to pay for his medical care, for his future. They can give him opportunities we simply cannot provide." John, overwhelmed, terrified, and desperate for a better life for Sarah, the seemingly stronger twin, had made an impossible choice. He consulted with Elizabeth, who was still weak from childbirth, her mind clouded by pain and fear. The doctor had painted a bleak picture of Michael's chances and a future of hardship for a family already struggling. It was presented as an act of mercy, a chance for Michael to have a life they couldn't give him. "We were so young, Sarah," Elizabeth sobbed, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "So afraid. We thought we were doing what was best, for everyone. We thought he wouldn't survive, or if he did, he'd be a burden. And they promised he'd have everything. They gave Michael up, signing papers under immense pressure, with the understanding that it was a closed adoption, that they would never see him again. They were told to simply move on, to focus on Sarah, their only child. The doctor, perhaps with good intentions, perhaps with darker motives, had facilitated the entire arrangement. He had even made sure no one would question the narrative, cementing the idea that Sarah was born alone. "We never forgot him, Sarah," John said, his voice thick with guilt. "Not a day went by, but we promised ourselves, we promised each other, that we wouldn't tell you, to protect us from the pain. It was a terrible, unforgivable mistake. We are so sorry." Sarah listened, her mind reeling. The parents she adored, the loving, steadfast couple who had raised her, had harbored such a monumental secret. The void she had always felt, the missing piece, was now explained, but the explanation brought a fresh wave of pain. She had a brother, an identical twin, and he had been given away, bought, separated from her, all in the name of a misguided, desperate attempt at a better life. The echoes of a missing half now screamed with the full force of a half-century of silence. Chapter 3. The Price of a Secret. The confession ripped through Sarah's family, tearing open old wounds and creating new ones. Her anger simmered, a raw, burning fire beneath the surface of her grief. How could they? How could her parents, the people she trusted implicitly, have made such a monumental, life-altering decision without her knowledge? And for 50 years, they had lived with this secret, watching her grow up, an only child, never knowing the truth of her missing half. Michael slowly regained consciousness, his body ravaged by illness, his mind foggy from medication and trauma. Sarah, with a cautious tenderness, began to tell him. The words felt fragile, immense. She started with the uncanny resemblance, the DNA match, then the agonizing confession from their parents. Michael's reaction was a mixture of pain, rage, and a profound, aching sorrow that mirrored Sarah's own. He had always felt it too, a sense of being disconnected, a deep-seated feeling of not quite belonging. His adoptive parents, he explained, Catherine and Robert Thompson, had been kind but distant. They were older, wealthy, and had adopted him after years of trying to conceive. They had never spoken of his birth, only that he was a gift. Michael had always carried a quiet burden of being different, a feeling of being an outsider, even in his own family. His life had been difficult. He had battled chronic illness from a young age, leading to his current critical condition. The revelation of his identical twin and the abandonment by his biological parents brought a sudden, brutal clarity to his lifelong struggle. "They bought me," Michael rasped, his voice weak but laced with bitter resentment. "My life was bought. My existence was a secret. All these years, all this time, and I had a twin. A sister." His eyes, so like Sarah's, filled with tears. "Did you ever feel it, Sarah, that something was missing?" "Every single day," Sarah whispered, gripping his hand. "Every single day." Their parents, Elizabeth and John, visited Michael's room, their faces etched with guilt and fear. They tried to explain, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the chasm between them was vast. Michael, raw with newly discovered pain, couldn't forgive them, not yet. Sarah, caught between her newfound twin and her heartbroken parents, felt torn. She understood their desperate plight in 1970. The societal pressures, the lack of resources. But understanding didn't erase the pain, the 50 years of lost connection. Dr. Stevens, with quiet compassion, explained Michael's medical needs. He required a kidney transplant. His kidneys, weakened by years of chronic illness, were failing. The perfect match was sitting right beside him. Sarah. The decision was immediate for Sarah. There was no hesitation. She would do it. She would give her brother, her lost twin, a chance at life. The act of donation became more than a medical procedure. It was a profound act of reunion. A symbolic gesture of reclaiming their shared past, of rebuilding what had been so cruelly severed. While they waited for the necessary preparations for the transplant, Sarah began to piece together Michael's early life. His adoptive parents, the Thompsons, had both passed away years ago. She traveled to their old estate in suburban Cleveland. a grand house filled with expensive but impersonal furniture. She found old photo albums, Michael as a child, dressed in pristine clothes, a quiet, almost melancholic expression in his eyes. There were no siblings in the photos, no boisterous family gatherings, only Michael, often alone or with his stiff, formal adoptive parents. It confirmed Michael's description of a solitary, often isolated upbringing. She found a dusty old legal file in a locked desk, a document from 1970 concerning minor adoption and sealed records. Hidden within the file, nestled amongst official papers, was a small worn envelope. Inside, a single faded letter, written on delicate stationery. It was from Catherine Thompson, Michael's adoptive mother, to John and Elizabeth Miller, their biological parents. The letter was a chilling revelation. Catherine wasn't just well-to-do, she was influential, connected. She spoke of her agreement with the doctor, how she had arranged for Michael to be given to them. She mentioned paying a significant sum, not just for his medical care, but for the doctor's silence and cooperation. She explicitly stated her desire for a complete break, for no contact, no chance of the biological parents ever reclaiming him. The letter was a contract, a transaction, a cold, calculated agreement to erase one twin from existence. Rest assured, the letter concluded, Michael will have every advantage, but for the sake of all parties, his true parentage will remain our private knowledge. We will be his parents, and he will never know otherwise. This is the condition of our arrangement. The doctor, the esteemed family physician, had been a key player in this monstrous deception, driven by greed or a misguided sense of social engineering. John and Elizabeth hadn't just given Michael up out of desperation. They had been pressured, perhaps even manipulated, into a deal by a powerful, childless couple and a corrupt doctor who saw an opportunity. It didn't fully absolve their parents, but it painted a far more complex picture of their choices, revealing the systemic forces that had shaped their lives and Michael's. The knowledge brought a new layer of pain, but also a fragile flicker of understanding. Chapter 5: The Unseen Strings of Fate. The discovery of Catherine Thompson's letter twisted the knife deeper into the heart of Sarah's family. It was one thing to be abandoned out of desperation. It was another to be sold, a transaction facilitated by a corrupt doctor and a powerful, childless couple. The anger at the Thompsons, who had bought Michael as a gift, and at the doctor, who had played God with their lives, burned hot and clear. The transplant proceeded. Sarah, resilient and determined, underwent the surgery without hesitation. Michael, weak but resolute, received her kidney, a literal piece of his missing half. The surgery was a success, a medical miracle, and a profound symbolic act of reunion. During Michael's long recovery, Sarah spent countless hours by his bedside. They talked endlessly, feverishly, trying to cram 50 years of separation into stolen hospital moments. He recounted his childhood with the Thompsons, a life of privilege but emotional coldness. Catherine and Robert had been more like benefactors than parents, providing every material comfort but little genuine warmth or affection. Michael's chronic illness, often dismissed by the Thompsons as frailty, had been a constant companion, a burden he bore largely alone. He shared his quiet yearning for connection, the feeling that he was an anomaly, an unrooted tree. Sarah, in turn, shared her life, her happy, loving childhood, the warmth of her parents, her fulfilling career, her stable marriage. She saw, with aching clarity, the stark contrast between their upbringings. Her parents, despite their monumental secret, had given her a life filled with love, a foundation that Michael had desperately lacked. The Thompsons, Sarah discovered, had been incredibly secretive about Michael's origins. They had moved frequently, isolating him from long-term friendships, carefully managing his medical records, seemingly to prevent any questions about his adoption or his twin. Their actions were not out of love, but out of a desperate need to maintain their carefully constructed facade of a perfect family. Michael's journey of recovery was not just physical, it was deeply emotional. He struggled with the complex layers of betrayal, from his biological parents who gave him away, from his adoptive parents who hid his true identity and treated him as a possession, and from the doctor who facilitated the whole cruel charade. Sarah was his anchor, his steady presence, a living testament to the bond that had endured despite everything. As Michael grew stronger, Sarah and he decided they needed to confront their biological parents again, not just for apologies, but for understanding, for a path towards healing. Elizabeth and John were racked with guilt. They had spent 50 years living with the secret, their lives shadowed by a silent grief. They had tried to make amends by giving Sarah an idyllic childhood, showering her with love, perhaps subconsciously trying to compensate for the twin they had lost. The letter from Catherine Thompson, which Sarah presented to them, horrified them anew. They had been desperate, yes, but they hadn't realized the full extent of the manipulation, the cold calculation behind the adoption. "We were so young, so naive," Elizabeth wept, clutching Michael's hand. "We believed the doctor. He made it seem like the only option. He told us we'd never be able to care for him, that he would surely die without their money and resources. We thought we were giving him a chance to live, even if it meant living without us." John, his voice thick with emotion, added, "We tried, Michael. After a few years, when things got better for us, when Sarah was growing, we tried to find you. We called the adoption agency, the doctor, but they had sealed the records, citing privacy agreements with the Thompsons. We were told you were happy, healthy. We just had to believe them. It wasn't a full absolution, but it provided a measure of context, a deeper understanding of the impossible choices made in a different era under immense pressure." Sarah felt a fragile sense of understanding for her parents. Forgiveness, she knew, would be a long, arduous process, but the first steps were being taken. Michael, however, struggled more deeply. The revelation that he had been bought and lived a life of isolated privilege, rather than being raised by his biological family, fueled a profound resentment. He had been denied a loving, connected childhood, exchanged for material comfort. He needed time, space, and extensive therapy to process the enormity of his stolen past. Dr. Stevens, who had witnessed the entire improbable saga unfold, offered his support beyond the medical realm. He connected Sarah and Michael with support groups for adopted twins and for individuals who had discovered hidden siblings later in life. He also connected them with an ethical review board, advocating for an investigation into the practices of the now deceased doctor and the Thompsons, ensuring that such a tragedy could never be repeated. The reunion, sparked by a critical medical need, had ripped open a decades-old wound, exposing not just a family secret, but a systemic injustice. Sarah and Michael, once separate entities living parallel lives, were now inextricably linked, bound by blood, shared history, and an unspoken promise to reclaim the years that had been stolen from them both. Chapter 7. Weaving the Unseen Threads. Michael's physical recovery was a testament to Sarah's selfless act, and to his own tenacious spirit. But the emotional healing was a far longer, more intricate process. He wrestled with a lifetime of identity confusion, the raw wounds of abandonment, and the bitter knowledge of his adoptive parents' calculated deception. Sarah became his fiercest advocate, his unwavering support. They sought therapy together, individually, and as a newly reunited sibling pair. They had 50 years of stories to tell, 50 years of separate lives to weave into a shared narrative. They started with childhood memories. Sarah would describe her favorite tree in their backyard, and Michael would recall a similar tree in his adoptive home, a strange echo across the miles. They found uncanny similarities in their preferences for food, music, and even subtle mannerisms. These small discoveries were profoundly moving, tangible proof of their innate connection, a comfort amidst the chaos of their unraveling past. Their biological parents, Elizabeth and John, visited Michael regularly, offering hesitant apologies, sharing old family photos, trying to bridge the chasm of silence they had created. Michael's initial anger slowly softened into a fragile understanding, though the scars remained. Forgiveness, he realized, was not about erasing the past, but about choosing to live with it and to build something new. They also delved into the life of the deceased Dr. Stevens. The Ethical Review Board launched a full investigation, uncovering a pattern of questionable adoptions facilitated by the doctor during the 1960s and 70s, often involving vulnerable young mothers and wealthy, desperate families. While the doctor couldn't be prosecuted, his legacy was irrevocably tarnished, and the findings led to stricter oversight of adoption agencies and medical ethics. It brought a small measure of justice to others who might have been affected by his practices. Michael eventually left the hospital, a new sense of purpose shining in his eyes. He decided to pursue a long-held dream of working with children, perhaps as a counselor or a mentor. His own difficult childhood, he realized, had given him a unique empathy for young people struggling with identity and belonging. He wanted to ensure that no child ever felt the profound loneliness and confusion he had endured. Sarah, inspired by Michael's journey, became an advocate for DNA-based family reunification. She started a small nonprofit organization dedicated to helping others who discovered hidden siblings or parents through genetic testing. She believed that every person deserved to know their full story, no matter how complicated. Their bond, forged in the sterile environment of a hospital room, grew into an unbreakable force. They celebrated birthdays together, now truly sharing their day, 50 years after their separate entrances into the world. They spent holidays creating new traditions, their families merging into a larger, more complex, but infinitely richer whole. David, Sarah's husband, embraced Michael as the brother-in-law he never knew. And their biological parents slowly began to find solace in the reunification of their twins, a bittersweet joy mixed with enduring regret. One evening, Sarah and Michael sat on Sarah's porch, the Ohio summer air warm and gentle. Michael had fully recovered, his face no longer gaunt, his eyes holding a new light. "It's strange, isn't it?" Michael mused, looking out at the twilight. "All those years, we were so close, yet so far apart, living completely different lives, but always connected," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "Always. That feeling, that void, it was you. And now it's gone, replaced by something so much bigger." Michael smiled, a genuine, easy smile that Sarah now recognized as her own. "I finally feel whole, Sarah. For the first time in my life, I feel like I truly belong. I have a past, a present, and a future. And I have you, my other half." Sarah looked at him, her heart overflowing. The memory of that hospital room, the shock of seeing her own face reflected in a stranger, still held a potent power. But now, it was no longer a place of pain and betrayal, but a sacred ground of reunion, a testament to the unseen threads of fate that had, against all odds, brought them home to each other. The twin she never knew, found in the most unlikely of places, was now the missing piece that made her life complete.